Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Hemp Grower Spotlight. My name is Philip Alberti, and I'm a commercial agriculture educator for the University of Illinois Extension. Today's episode will feature High Plains Grains and Green Harvest Solutions. Our guests are experienced row crop producers and custom service providers from Northwest Illinois who wish to give the 2020 Hemp Producer Class a full spectrum review of the biggest lessons learned from the 2019 season. A large portion of the program today will focus on lessons learned with regards to planting methods, fertility, harvesting, and storage. This video will be available on our website shortly after the program, and I would encourage you to look at the screen right now and see that there is currently a QR code up at the top right. That is a program evaluation for today's webinar. I would really encourage you to take a few minutes after the program to go ahead and fill that out for us. It tells us how we did and how we can improve. Ben, Grant, and Ross, please tell us a little bit about who you are and why you decided to grow hemp this year.
I can go. So I'm Ross Vehmeier with Green Harvest Solutions. So Green Harvest Solutions got started last year in hemp. We're a custom harvest operation or operator, and we grew hemp last year as well. The reason for getting into it, I think, is the same reason everybody else got into it. It was different. It was exciting, potentially lucrative if you know what you're doing, and had a bunch of different opportunities, not only oil but fiber, seed, you name it. So we dug in and got into it in a time kind of in our area where, in Illinois it was the first year. Wisconsin had been doing it a year, but it was something new. It was something exciting, and we were up to the challenge. So that's why we dug in.
And I'm Ben Moest with High Plains Grains. My background a little bit, grew up, still live on large commercial hog operation and grain operation. High Plains Pork is the name of that entity. So we've been farming a long time, and what kind of got us into this it's really a move. We were looking to diversify our operation.
That, and you kind of have a nice segue into my next question here. This is traditionally thought of as more of a specialty crop operation. What was kind of the driving force behind taking your commercial row crop knowledge and applying it to essentially what is traditionally a different type of production system? Could you maybe go through your thought process there on what you thought?
Yeah. So my brother and I, we started on this kind of in the summer of 2018. We were helping another local grower, doing it the old-fashioned way by hand. It was small acreage, and we were just kind of seeing what that's like, and we're like, oh, this is kind of specialty crop like, and then there was all this talk of people saying, hey, CBD demand's big. We need to feed a larger market than just a few people at a time. So there's the calls for scaling. And so, that's kind of the point where we felt, we're like, hey, this could be an entry point. If we're one of the first to kind of figure out some methods to scale this a little more and make it more, apples to apples to like standard crop production, that's going to make a lot more guys comfortable with getting into it. If you don't have to get all this crazy specialty equipment around, if we wanted to replicate modern farming practices and apply it to this as much as possible, because what we noticed over the time is there's this massive gap between the people who really know hemp, like the plant itself and like how it grows and how to produce good hemp, and then the people who know how to farm. And there's a huge gap between the two. And so we've been trying our best to kind of bridge that gap, bring the farming expertise, the equipment, all of the expertise on that side of things, and then meet and talk to people who understand hemp itself and collaborate that way. Because again, this is one of those things that nobody, depending on what side you're on, whether you're a long-time hemp person or a long-time farmer, you can't come into this industry with just that knowledge base and expect it to just go smoothly. You really got to work together with people, we've come to find out. And so our angle coming into it was we wanted to get this to the point where it's very much replicable to like other crops as well.
Great. All right, so kind of moving into this pre-plant checklist, before we even start thinking about growing this crop, we found that it's very important to know your costs up front. What were some of the biggest potential things that growers should be aware of before even getting a license or applying to grow this crop?
Yeah, hands down, like we got it bulleted there, budgets through and through. Like, do the numbers first before you dive into this. I mean, that's where we started, kind of what we talked about. We like to start the process backwards. See what the market is, what the market can bear in terms of prices, see what kind of revenue you can generate, just potential numbers is what you need, and then develop a budget from that way. And that's kind of the way we went about it, and it worked out pretty well. But at the end of the day, we through this past growing season, 2019, I did talk to a lot of different producers who, we were halfway, 3/4 of the way through the growing season, and they had no idea what the stuff was worth, where to check market prices, things of that. And it's like, if you're going to get into this and you hear about all the risk involved, number one, know that it's very true. It is a highly risky industry. And then number two, crunch the numbers first. If you can afford to take on the project and, either way, however it goes, success or not, be prepared, because like I said, this is very risky. So do the budgets first, I would say, before anything else, and then start on your operations plan. But the numbers is very important.
So where did you guys go to get those numbers? When you started putting these budgets together, what were the best sources for you? Were it conversations with others involved in the industry? Was it going online to some of these other national databases that are available for the market trends? What were you guys looking at when you decided this is what we're going to use?
Yeah, to start out, it was really just references, people in the industry. But we started there and we visited a processor because, we heard numbers of, it can bring this for a kilo of oil or this for a pound of biomass. And we're like, that's all hearsay. We want to hear it out of the horse's mouth. So we went directly to a processor who was in the business of making these products and selling these products. And so we started there, verified that these numbers were in fact true in terms of a market. But then over this past year, just like so many other things in hemp, it's evolved so quickly. Now, my main point for just checking market reference points and, like prices and all that, the one exchange I follow would be Pan Exchange. They're now a paid service. They were free this past year, but now they're paid because they got enough subscribers. But it's a really good exchange. They now produce a monthly report on fundamentals in terms of what's going on in the industry, what's the talk going on between processors. They track Colorado, Oregon, Kentucky. Then they have a newly added in the last couple months a Midwest region and then a Northeast region, and they track biomass prices and oil prices for all those regions. And basically, it's all just like a USDA type thing where you do a monthly surveying around qualified people within the industry, and then every month they come out with a really well done report on better than most of the ones I've seen so far. But they've got a website and everything, and you'll be able to check out sample monthly reports just to kind of get an idea. But I speak highly of that one because they seem like a really good source, because a lot of their fundamental news has been really nice to see, because like us being down in the trenches of this industry, doing stuff, we've seen that report come out every month, and a lot of what the report says mirrors what we're experiencing. So it feels like they have a very good handle and, their hand on what the information flow in the industry is. So I really like that exchange. But, the other ones, like Cush Marketplace, that's more just a marketplace. They don't do much on the,
Like the eBay of hemp.
right. Yeah. Kind of. Yeah. And then there's a couple other ones, but,
Hemp Benchmarks, New Frontier. There's a bunch that are out there, but trying to find something that's actually local and or even regional based on where you are, it's very difficult, and it's starting. So again, I would probably agree. Trying to talk with the processor ahead of time, somebody that's close by, is going to be your best bet, but those do provide other options for folks. So, okay, moving on from budgets into field selection. All right, so, you've crunched the numbers, you feel pretty confident about this, and now you're looking at where you're actually going to plant this stuff. What were, some of the biggest factors in your mind when making a field selection for this, just based on what you had discussed with other folks, and then based on the type of soils that we have in this area?
Yeah, the biggest thing is moisture management with the ground. We would say that flat ground, deep topsoil ground is, while that can produce high quality crops, it's with hemp, I think a little more of a risk that you want to take, because one thing we found out, it's pretty well established that hemp really does not like too much moisture. It prefers to be on the drier side of things instead of on the the wetter side of things. So yeah, I would say if you have ground with that you can get the water off of, that's the biggest thing. Because if we run into a 2019 or fall of 2018, it's just been a continuous wet cycle we've had. If you can't get the water off your field, you're gonna have problems with your hemp crop, because it's just moisture and disease. Because you don't have stacked trait hybrid hemp. You don't have there are really high quality seed suppliers in the country. There's not that many, and then there's a rest that pretend to be good. But either way, as a whole industry, they're still decades behind in terms of quality, replicability, all these things that we're accustomed to in standard row crops. But with hemp, because you have to raise it organically and all these other things that you got to get the water off of, because if there's moisture in the field, it's going to breed disease, especially on the leaves. You'll get that leaf spot. I mean, I bet anyone on this call who grew this past year probably knows that for a fact. Like, they saw the leaf spot on their plants. I mean, it was across the board. Just the region was wet overall. So the best looking fields that we saw in our experience over the fall were the fields that had slope. You'll get the water off of it. And, if you're looking at soil types like CEC, I would lean more towards a rockier, sandier versus more of a heavy clay. It doesn't need fantastic dirt to grow. You can grow it on pretty marginal dirt. It's just a matter of how well you take care of it after that. But biggest thing is water management, I would say, by far.
Especially with the years that we've had. I mean, last year was crazy, but you have to anticipate that that's kind of the norm. It's been that way for a few.
Sure. So, I mean, maybe this kind of goes into our, for planting and in-season management, but also, field selection with regards to a clean field. If you don't have these herbicide options that you typically would in another crop that you're growing, was that a consideration, type of field that you decided to plant this in its history of weed production?
History of what?
Weed production.
Sorry, say that again.
Was it, given that you don't have many control options in terms of herbicides or any herbicides for this crop, when making a field selection, was that something you guys thought of just based off of previous management?
Yep. We definitely, on our operation, we don't have a whole lot of trouble with, resistant weeds. We've done a pretty good job of keeping on top of that. So we had a pretty wide range of where we were going to pick, but that was something right up front. Knowing that I can't spray, knowing the problem with water hemp or Palmer amaranth, those are things that can really overtake the field if not managed right. The big thing we saw this year was just the grass. The grass was brought on by the excess amount of moisture. But I'd rather take the grass versus the water hemp or the Palmer amaranth or something like that. That even if I did spray it, it might not die. But then again, if I'm out there mechanically taking it out, it could easily take over my field much faster than I can get through weeding it. So that was a thing that we had a conversation about before, where we're going to plant it. But again, we've done a pretty good job on our operation of keeping those resistant weeds out of it, changing up herbicides, different modes of action, stuff like that.
Well, we saw fields this year that were overtaken by weeds just because gentleman up in Wisconsin, he planted into a pasture and he never harvested. I don't think he harvested any of it, did he?
Yeah.
So going into a field that had soybeans or corn or something like that is probably a smart move year one. If you're looking at larger acres, a pasture, you're going to know how to run a hoe by the end of the year, I can tell you that.
Like I said, with the genetics being so far behind relative to other industries, we did not see in our field this past year majority of emergence until at least 3 weeks post-plant. I mean, we were just every day staring at the field. We're like, are these seeds going to come out of the ground? Because we went direct seed, so we knew that was a bit of a risk in itself, and we were nervous. Well, emergence didn't start until 3 weeks, and then it lasted 2 weeks when we were seeing, it was 5 weeks post-plant, we saw a new sprout.
Well, it just brings up a really great point, though. These delayed emergences, you might get weed escapes in different areas of the field. Weed control is going to be an issue. Fertility might be a little different because of that. So a lot of things you need to be aware of that we're not getting these uniform fields, so very important. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about soil testing and what you used as recommendations. There's not a lot of good information out there for CBD fertility and how it impacts the growth of these plants. What was kind of some things that you looked at? Did you pull any soil tests prior to planting this year? What was on your mind there?
We didn't pull any soils to test on the piece that we put it on this year. That had been done in the previous year. Just kind of on our field rotation as we do a 3-year. We break it up that way. So we had a good idea of what was there before. In regards to residual herbicides and pesticides, we don't use a lot of heavy residuals to begin with. So we weren't necessarily worried about that, but we definitely took that into account on what was sprayed there last year versus some fields like when we had delayed planting or delayed spraying last year, we had to bump up different rates, spray a couple different things on those fields. So something like that I would keep in mind from the previous year to stay away from something to use a really heavy residual on that could definitely ding your germination. The heavy metals, we didn't really do too much about that. There's not a whole lot you can do about that. depending on what dirt you got to work with. If you do pull soil samples and you do have heavy or high levels of heavy metals in it, I'd probably stray away from it because the hemp will remediate that out of the soil and will show up later. Fertility, our field is a field that we've applied a lot of hog manure on over the years, so the fertility is very good there to begin with. But in terms of comparing it to corn or soybeans, your hemp is going to be more like your soybeans. They don't take a lot of fertility. They take a little bit at end, but in terms of P and K, all that stuff is pretty marginal levels there. You can get by with the hemp. If it's there, it'll find it and remediate that out of the soil. But if you're going on some really, really rocky stuff or something like that, I would definitely recommend pulling a soil sample, getting some recommendations, and then getting it amended accordingly to that, just to kind of get your soils back into just a general healthy state, not just for hemp, but just a general healthy soil state there and stuff like that. But,
I think I really wanted to bring up the points about residual pesticides, herbicides, and heavy metals here, with the crop being the remediator that it is. This is something that depends on where you are in the state. If you're in an area with a history of industrial production, that might be something you want to take into account, because these plants will take up these pesticides and herbicides. They'll take up heavy metals into the final product, and that will ultimately make your product less valuable and or worthless in some cases, depending. So it's something you want to keep in mind, that this plant has a very particular phytoremediation ability. And so if you're in an area where it's a concern, you might be better off getting a test ahead of time. Okay. Again, not too much information out there really regarding CBD hemp specific fertility recommendations, so be aware of that. Moving on into seed selection. This is something that is kind of, it's a moving target here, I would imagine, for some of you folks out there trying to make seed selection. Seed quality is one of the bigger issues facing producers currently in this industry. How do you go about vetting quality seed suppliers? What are you looking for when discussing with them?
This is, I would say, top of the things in this whole project. I mean, seed is right up there. It might be top 3 most important.
Seed and supplier.
Right.
That's in tandem. So not just the seed, but who you're dealing with, because the seed person that you pick, or the company, is your coach, at least for some parts of what you're going to do this year.
But at the end of the day, you got to do your best to try and get a feel for what their background is, how long you've been producing seed. Try and find out as much about the supplier as you can. Are they coming from a long time background? Are they new to this thing? Big red flag is anyone new to this industry, because virtually most people are, and so there's not just this huge database of just established experts that you can just rely on for information. So it's just, you have to be wary of everyone you're going into business with in this. And on the seed side, that is probably the biggest scam in the industry, is the seed, because it's the easiest one to pull off. You can't, from the eyeball test, you can't until you put them in the ground and grow it. So you do take a big risk on the front side, because you won't know the answer until later on when it's too late. So you got to do your best on the front side. And so, just common things you need to do when you're talking to these seed suppliers, just COAs, so certificate of analysis. So if you're talking to a seed supplier and they've got all these different strains and this and that, you want to see COAs on it, and also the important thing on COAs is ask for full season, full maturity COA. So one of the big things that a lot of seed suppliers don't mention is that virtually no hemp in this country is able to go the full flower cycle, the full 8 to 9 weeks flower cycle, and stay within the THC compliance. So often what happens is you've got to get it tested before it goes hot, right? Everyone knows that. And so what a lot of seed suppliers do is they'll send COAs for, either midway through the season where the THC still shows compliance, but then the CBD might only be half or 3/4 of what it should be, because the way it works is you've got an 8-week flower period. In the first 4 weeks, it'll put on about half of its THC and about half of its CBD production, it's cannabinoids. And then the last 4 weeks is when it really piles on the other half. And so if you get these COAs and just ask, what week of flower? That's a very pointed question you need to ask the seed supplier. Say, you sent me the COA. What week of flower was that pulled? Was it pulled from week 4 or was it pulled from week 8? Because that's a huge difference. If you are using the week 4 COA as your full maturity baseline and you're watching testing, you're going to have a problem, because it's going to be hotter way sooner than you were expecting, because you didn't know when that COA was pulled. So big thing with COA is know like what week it is. So a lot of seed suppliers know that, they understand that how that works. I mean, that's their job, that's what they do. But a lot of growers don't. And so there's a lot of, kind of shadier seed suppliers who can kind of take advantage of the lack of understanding. So when you ask about COAs, ask what week it's from, and then say, can I see compliant COAs and can I see full season? Because you want to know what that plant is capable of. If they send you a full season one and it says 0.6, 0.7 THC, well, then you at least know how bad it can possibly get, so that you can make decisions from there. And then that tells you, okay, when do I need to get my test done? When do I need to get harvest? And you make much more sound operational decisions based on that. So just understanding that specific strain and how it develops oil through an 8-week period is really important on the COA side.
Ben, you bring up a great point though with varieties, right? So right now, what is a variety in the CBD industry? If one person is selling a particular variety, say cherry wine, for example, and then Ross over there is selling a variety that he is claiming to be cherry wine, we don't have the certification that we have for, say, the seed that we're getting from our pioneers and, our big seed companies where they say, this is what it is, that's what it is. So beware, buyer beware. And with those certificates of analysis, call the laboratory, right? So these things are being, there's some fraud out there, they're being doctored. So make sure if you get a certificate of analysis, call the lab where it's stated and make sure that it lines up. You're going to have to do a lot of vetting, I feel, when you're doing and getting involved in this industry. So that's very important.
I'd like to reiterate what you just said there about calling the labs, because that is a really good point. As from where we got our seed supplier, and I talked to somebody else that supposedly had gotten the same seed through a third-party person from where we got our seed from, and they showed me their COAs, and it was definitely not the same COAs that we got directly from the seed supplier. So they had the same exact variety that we did, and then they showed me completely different COAs, which was a big red flag to me. Was saying, hey, this, I don't know if this actually came from that person or if this was just a bucket of seeds they found on the ground and they're just selling it to you here like that. So I would say that was a really good point you brought up there.
Feminized, I think, is the only real option for us from an oil perspective. We saw a few non-fem fields last year. Weeding in the early stages is one of the biggest challenges. Culling males in the later stages of a non-feminized field is going to be a real trick. My advice for anybody first year, even second year, feminized is a much smarter option. You're looking for oil. And one of the things that's really important to understand, as those plants mature, like Ben was talking earlier, as the plants mature and the males do what they do and start looking for females, you talk about oil loss. It's very significant and it's very early, and you will not be able to keep up with it. We advise feminized. We harvested all feminized last year. We looked at a lot of non-feminized fields, but I didn't know a lot of non-feminized producers that actually had a successfthe year, at least from my perspective.
Right, and I just want to clarify in case some people don't totally understand the difference between feminized and non-feminized. Feminized means that the seed supplier has developed a stable. If it's feminized, it's developed a stable genetic, base that, every time you grow that plant, you're going to have vast majority female plants and no males out there. It's never 100%. It's the quality feminized seed sources. You're down to like 0.00 whatever percent. You'll still have some males out there, but at the end of the day, that's such an insignificant amount of males that it wouldn't pollinate your whole field if you didn't get every last one of them out. Just the thing too, last year there was kind of some paranoia on the growing side. Everyone said if I have one male within a 10-mile radius, everything's getting pollinated. That's not true. It's within reason. It's kind of a threshold thing with anything else. If the field's 10% males, yeah, you're gonna, most of that field's gonna get. How about your goal? Before you go into hemp in general, remember that there's all these different markets and ways to produce. If your goal is to produce CBD and oil production and sell that, well then you're gonna want to go feminized, because non-fem is just not it's not economically feasible to go that route because of what you're gonna have to do. And vast majority of non-fem seed, it's not 50-50. Like there's times where you'll get 60, 70% males. Well, if you go cull all that, you're just not going to have anything left. We saw some fields of that this year where somebody tried that idea of, we bought non-fem seed on hundreds of acres and said we're going to cull half because that's what will come up. They got one of those 5 or 6 fields culled. it looked just like a war had just gotten done there. It was just like no plants left. And on top of that too, non-fem seed lines, like they're not the same plant structure. They don't produce flowers in the same way that feminized do in terms of size and then the oil it produces. It's different genetic lines. And so if your goal is CBD, feminized is the way to go.
If you are interested in learning more about autoflower, Purdue actually just did a great webinar with New West Genetics that we did last week. I can send that to you. Just reach out to me. I'd be glad to share that. A lot of great information on how to do some autoflower planting if that's something that you're looking to do. Something I wanted to kind of ask you guys about. So, we're talking about this pollination that we're worried about, right? But this is mechanical, this is scale. And so we're used to taking those types of hits in some way. You guys talk about this in your video. One plant's not going to ruin the field. You still want to be smart about culling and being vigilant and being out there, but it's scale. And so you're going to lose some plants. You're going to get some seed. I don't know of a single grower that I work with that didn't have a plant that at least had some seed, whether it be from hermaphrodites, males, or feral hemp in their area that did that. So just something to be concerned about. Did you guys see, and a question coming in here, did you guys see any flipping of males to female, from females to males, or turning into hermaphrodites due to stress this year late season?
That was something we were concerned about. I don't know if we ever totally witnessed it. Because we heard about that a lot. And
I would say the majority of what we saw when we found our males was kind of more in the higher stress areas. But, back to we're not experts on the whole geneticist and stuff like that. So, I couldn't specifically say, okay, well, it got stressed and it flipped like that. We saw the male, and I just happened to make the observation that they were more towards kind of like our drowned out areas of the fields or stuff like that, not necessarily in the big open ones. We did find some in the big open ones, but the majority of them were found kind of more in stressful areas and stuff like that. So that was something we were aware of, but I don't have the knowledge to be able to say well, this was a female plant and then it got flipped or something like that.
So I guess we're just trying to minimize stress is going to be the best option, and that just comes with your cultural practices, weed control, getting water off the field. If you can manage stress conditions best that you can help to minimize those hermaphrodites. But that's good to know. Again, I think that comes down to genetic stability, and some varieties are going to be able to handle those stresses more than others. It's just finding which ones that do. Did you guys plant any autoflower? Another question coming in here briefly. No.
Called our seed supplier, and they're like, oh yeah, no, that's definitely an autoflower. We're still working on that before we release it. I was like, oh, he's like, it just must have gotten, the machine wasn't cleaned out as well, the seed cleaner or something. We were sorting seed and it got dropped in the bag. So we did see it, and it flowered and went to full maturity. It was at least 3-4 weeks before the rest of the field started.
Yeah, and there was a farm north of us. We went up and did a field survey. They had autoflower, I think 5 acres.
Yeah.
And it's a completely different plant. I'll say that. For those of you that haven't seen it, it's like a bush versus a tree. Very small, very clean plant, not big stalks, not big stems, very manageable. For those of you, first time doing maybe a half acre or, a small chunk or something, I think autoflower is a good move. It's not a Christmas tree. That's a big plus, especially when you start harvesting. But small, rotatable into a drying space, very manageable. They're not going to rip you apart. You can still get through the field, as you get close to flower period. So definitely not against autoflower. We just didn't do it.
We're moving into the planting period now, and so knowing when to get the crop in the ground was very important to get the overall success from a germination standpoint, from a crop growth and development standpoint. What were the conditions you guys looked for to ensure good establishment and to get a good plant that you were looking for?
Biggest one is soil temperatures. Really, we didn't plant ours until about June 12th. I think the seeds went in the ground. We were good and ready. The soil temps were good. We had a cover crop before it that got established, had nice weed control. Then we prepped the soil, and then the soil temps were all plenty high, and we had good moisture. We waited for right after a rain. And all that stuff, so there's moisture in the topsoil. But guys plant hemp in July 1st, and it still made plenty of oil, put on big flowers at the end of the season. It's not like corn and beans, you have to plant it really early. So waiting for the soil temperatures to be right, and then understanding that feminized thing, it doesn't matter how early you plant it, it's going to flower when it's going to flower. So you're taking the risk of essentially, let's say you planted April 1st, and the soil temps were just somehow high enough April 1st. Let's say you plant April 1st. It will sit in this large tree-like vegetative state and not put on flowers until that photo period changes. So basically think of it as a big tree exposed to wind and the elements for an extra 2-3 weeks, versus if you waited to plant until June 1st, well then that 3 weeks of time where it was this big is gone. It got this big and then flowers started. So it's a game like that. Your big thing to keep in mind is the date. You can push it well into June. That's totally normal. I've talked to a lot of seed suppliers from out west. One specifically we really trust in Oregon. Every year he does not plant any time really before mid-June, and then he finishes up about early July. He plants his crop every year.
Well, and one thing we touched on a little bit on the seed side, and as we kind of roll into planting here, the environmental profile of each strain is very important. So when you build that relationship with your seed supplier, and I'm kind of go online and find a seed supplier, so I'm going to say that up front. You need to have a conversation, this is a phone, conversation with whoever that person is to make sure that they understand, here's where we're growing. Here's the field we have available to us. Here's what the temperature is. And as Ben talks about, the supplier from Oregon has got a very similar weather pattern to what we deal with. Same with Kentucky. So if you had a seed supplier from either of those places, hey, it's probably going to match pretty well with what you're going to deal with weather-wise. Colorado, whole different game. California, whole different game. Great seed suppliers there, but does it necessarily match what our weather pattern is going to be? No. So when they give you a seed menu, whether it's autoflower, full season, whatever it is, start looking at the profiles of each of those seeds, what they like, what they don't like, what the soil preference was, how it was grown, and then ask those questions. And I know we're into planning now, but that's a huge point, and that's why it's important. Don't just look for the cheapest seed. You will pay for what you get. You are paying for the education. Remember that. The seed is a big piece. The education is a bigger piece, because that seed supplier should be holding your hand all the way into planning, and then you need to be able to ask questions. As Ben said, they picked up the phone and called their guys and said, hey, here's what's going on. Hey, we got these autoflowers in the field. A fly-by-night online company is not going to answer your call. A real seed supplier will answer your call gladly and tell you what's going on.
It's just like corn and soybeans. We get our corn and our beans now. Well, they're not producing that in Florida and California. They're producing that locally through the seed company's contract, so they know that variety was grown here and it did good in this specific region. So we buy seed corn up here in northern Illinois. It got produced in northern Illinois versus guys buying seed corn in southern Illinois. Could be the same variety, just produced in a different way. It could just slightly different. So try and take all the good managements we do in row crop production and seed selection and stuff, and just apply it to this.
Yep. Just understand the context in which those plants were produced. If you get the COA from your seed supplier, if they're a Colorado supplier, well, understand that the context that they produced that seed in is dry, arid Colorado climate. It's under irrigation and all this. So it's fine and dandy that you got this piece of paper that says this plant's capable of producing 20% oil, but is it capable of producing 20% oil in my backyard? That's what you have to find out.
The field. So we're talking about soil preparation, equipment calibration. What were the steps that you guys went through for a new crop with having to essentially modify your own seed meters to do this in a new area of this industry? What was the thought processes for you guys going into that?
Well, with the planning, in terms of getting equipment ready, we used a film planter this year that laid a translucent film as we planted as kind of an insurance thing. But I would say it was unneeded in where I planted. I'm not saying it couldn't be applicable somewhere else, but look at your planter, prep it just like you prep for corn and beans. You're checking disc openers, you're checking, making sure everything's greased, making sure everything's free and moving, your gauge wheels so you got consistent depth. Talk to your seed supplier on that. What should I be planting my seed depth at? A lot of them said 1/4 to 1/2 inch. I would disagree with that. I would say probably plant more closer to 1 inch or so, maybe a little deeper. With some of the stuff we saw this year, we saw stuff coming through, several inches of dirt, no problem, emerging kind of roughly the same time as some of the shallower ones were planted there. But, just be good about keeping your planter maintained. Your planter in your row crops, is one of your most important pieces of equipment. So you go through that every spring with a fine-tooth comb, you're checking for wear parts or something like that that could kind of slightly throw off where you're going to place that seed. And then in terms of stuff that we had on the planter, going to the meters and stuff, we've been using a lot of precision planting products, any type of aftermarket stuff on your planter for quite a while. So we had the technology on it already, and it just took me kind of calling precision planting, and a lot of the other guys were looking into doing direct seeding. They already had some insight on it to kind of figure out what I needed to put in that meter to singulate that small of a seed, which what I found out was hemp seed is a lot like a sugar beet seed. It's really small. They already have plates that can singulate seed like that, no problem. So we got some, regular plates. We punched our own holes in it. We only punched 4 holes in it to make sure we can get down to that low population. But nothing super spectacular or like over the top that we had to do to this planter, other than the fact that our planter we planted with was one of the film planters. We would not use it again in our operation, but if you're in a much drier climate, some sandy or something like that, where you don't have a lot of moisture, I think the film could be very helpful. The film that we planted is now in no way, shape, or form used for weed control. It's translucent. The weeds see the thing and they'll grow right through it. So don't look at the film like, okay, it's just going to drown out weeds here. It does not do that. All that film was specifically for was to create a so-called greenhouse effect, draw moisture to the top, create a little bit more heat right over the seed trench, kind of give you a sense of security when you're doing this direct seed, direct planting with hemp, that so-called fragile seed. We found out that it is not a fragile seed. It is a weed. It will drop off your plate and your planter on the end rows, and it will grow. Nothing you have to do anything there. But, we in terms of running the planter, I went very slow. I went 1.5 to 2.5 miles an hour, which is probably about half of what somebody would do with a standard corner bean planter. That's where my monitor was telling me I was singulating seeds 100%. It was just going along there. I was really liking it, and I was liking my seed spacing. Could you bump that up faster? Sure. And is it going to plant as good? I don't know. I didn't try it. I didn't. That's something you can mess around with yourself. But if you already have a John Deere or a Kinsey or whatever planter you have, there are. Or if you run technology on it, there are things you can do. You can use that planter to plant this seed. You don't need a specialty hemp planter to do this. A lot of the guys have the equipment in their shed already here in the Midwest.
Yeah, because planting seeds is just. Is there unique things about hemp? Yeah, but at the end of the day, we're planting seeds. We're putting seeds in the ground. That job doesn't change. That's what we're good at as farmers. That's what we do year after year. We're good at putting seeds in the ground. So keep that in mind for one, that you. As just a regular farmer, don't feel like you have no knowledge on hemp. You do. If you've been farming a long time, you do have a lot of knowledge in terms of this, and you can, kind of form different ideas around that. But don't cut yourself short on your ability to put seeds in the ground and grow up a successful crop. But like I was saying, we were told that you can't go direct seed, and it's this fragile seed and this and that. The depth was the biggest one we came to find out. We did the film and the really shallow depth as like this kind of, like Grant said, insurance policy, like, hey, we were told that direct seed might not work, so let's just try and give it the best possible scenario to get out of the ground. Well, would have done it another 1/2 inch deeper, at least, maybe 1.5 inches depth, because what we saw in coming back to field selection, if you get on any sort of slope that it can get the water off, if you only plant that seed at 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch, it's gone. There was one chunk of our field where where all the water runs, and it went to a waterway, and that section of the field, you could just see it clear as day. We're like, what was with the germ over here? The rest of the section looks pretty decent, and then it's like this area, just all the seeds washed away. So if you plant really shallow, better be really flat. But again, you don't want to do really flat because it'll probably drown out if we get too much moisture. So that's what I say, the depth, we're more than comfortable going at least 1 inch this year, maybe a little deeper, because 1/2 inch was just too shallow. We washed away a bunch of seeds with all that rain we got.
Well, we saw that in a lot of fields too, especially near the river in Illinois. A few fields that we visited there, probably maybe a 10% or excuse me, a 10 acre loss on a 40 acre field just because there was a ton of water.
Yeah.
And anybody, that remembers last year, there was no shortage of water, especially early in the year. So as Ben's saying, that's hemp is all about mitigating risk. Okay. There are insurances for hemp this year, which is different than last year, but it's still a risky game. And the insurance payout is not like corn. It's not going to nearly cover what you have invested. So take the time to make sure that you can mitigate risk wherever you can.
I see there's a question there on population rates and spacing.
I would like to get to that now. Your population is gonna kind of reflect what variety you're planting and just hemp in general. So what we noticed this year, we planted 38-inch rows and we planted 4,000 seeds to the acre. About 1,000 more seeds to the acre than most people were planting. And we were looking for kind of a 38 by 42 spacing or so. I would say that was too tight, way too tight. Our plants got very big, and they started to grow together, and then would restrict sunlight to the bottom half of the plant, which in turn kind of came back to, well, I'm not actually getting flowers at the bottom half of the plant. The only part I got flowers was the top half of the plant that got sunlight. And then in terms of weed control, no, don't plant hemp. Don't go into hemp planting looking at spacing or your population in terms of weed control, because that's exactly what I did, and that's exactly what kind of messed me up on the back end there. I figured, okay, well, we'll get the rows a little narrower than they said. We'll get the plants a little closer than they said, and then hopefully we can get through kind of the first kind of few weeks there where the field is bare and weed, and then it'll start to shade out. Not happening. That plant it's slow growth stage. It takes a while to get through that, and then once it gets into its faster part of the vegetation stage, even then, you're towards the end of July, so you've got many weeks into that, and then they got too big. So don't look at picking populations in terms of weed control.
The population is not quite as important. Think about how you're going to handle the weeds. Don't think about necessarily how you're going to drown them out, as these guys said. That's not the deal. And so row spacing becomes a big deal. Everything we planted last year was on 38-inch rows, which, as Grant said earlier, it's a little bit more difficult to manage that actually. And as we talk about harvest, one thing to think about with row spacing is how's it coming out of the field. And we'll touch on that when we start talking about harvest, but where that spacing needs to line up with whatever your harvest plan is coming out.
So yeah, moving on to this, what is the best cover crop to use? We're kind of running a little bit behind, but briefly tell us your experiences with your oat cover crop this year and what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah. So to answer the question, it depends on what you have timing, what's the best to use. I've been trying to get a cover crop system, a no-till organic cover crop system where the cover crops do the weed control for me. But if you don't cereal rye is the idea in the fall. Seed a really dense rate of cereal rye, because if you don't plant hemp until June, early July, that's enough time for cereal rye to mature, to which then it's crimpable. And then you can just crimp cereal rye over, and then just, if you want to strip till it, otherwise most people, you got modern planter with hydraulic downforce and stuff like that, if you're going into crimp cereal rye, plant right into that, because that's going to be your best chance. My take, because of what I've seen from many other organic no-till producers around the country in terms of corn and bean production. But what we did this past year, because we didn't get into hemp until the new year had started, so we didn't get any fall seeding of any rye done. So we had to say, okay, what are my options if I'm starting in the spring? And so really the only quality cover crop that people use in spring is oats, because you can seed it really early and they're great. What's great about oats is, number one, they're very, very good at jump-starting mycorrhizae fungi production. Mycorrhizae fungi is absolutely critical to producing quality plants. I mean, just in any crop, doesn't matter what it is, hemp, corn, beans. So they get mycorrhizae fungi started. That's what transports nutrients back and forth between plants down into the soil. So oats are very good for stimulating that. Then they also, what was really big and what we observed just clear as day this year was oats have an allelopathic effect with wheat. So oat roots release some sort of chemical or whatever they release, but it has an allelopathic effect where it will kill wheat. And so roughly after that oats are gone, that allelopathic effect lasts, from what I've read in publications, about 3 weeks to a month. And from our experience this year, we planted oats in as early as we could get in there, which was like April 15th this past spring. Ideally, oats are getting in like mid-March in this region, just because it's good to get oats in while it's maybe a little frost in the ground yet, and then you can let some snow get on them yet and stuff like that. That helps with germination. But we didn't plant the oats until about April 20th. They got about, by the time we were planting June 10th when we terminated them, they might have been like that tall. So it wasn't a huge crop, but what it did was I had 45 days from April 1st until we were going to plant in mid-June there. And so I didn't want to have just a bare open field, because everyone knows when you have a bare open field, what does Mother Nature do? It covers it up with weeds, because that's what Mother Nature does. It always covers the soil. And so we wanted to avoid a seed bank building up in that time. If there's going to be a down period where there's nothing growing on it, I would say especially if you're in the spring, get oats on there, because that's going to, number one, keep your seed bank controlled. You're not going to have new weeds propagate. And then the oats have the added benefit of the allelopathic effect. Even us terminating and tilling those oats in, we still had a clean field for 3+ weeks before. And that's what made it critical for emergence, that when we talked about earlier how you can lose the plants in there because the weeds came out before your plants did. The oats helped us bridge that gap this year. So I would say that was one of the biggest lessons we learned this year. If you're just starting up in the spring, oats is great because of mycorrhizal fungi stimulation and the allelopathic effect with weeds.
That's great. So moving into, weed management in season, weed management has been touted as one of the biggest or the most important aspects of hemp production, considering this is an organic system. We don't have any herbicides, insecticides, or pesticides labeled for this crop in Illinois. What was your experience like with weeds in season once those oats and that kind of allelopathic effect had diminished? And then what did you use for weed control? What were your strategies there?
So blood, sweat, and tears. That's how we did it. There's
No vacations.
Yeah. We lived from like mid-July through, till flowers started when they got real big, and we mostly had it canopied. We basically lived in the field. It's just, I wish there was a magic way to deal with it right now that we knew of, but we don't. We've seen them kind of, last year was kind of late season. Some people built some like mechanical weeders. We can like pull behind a tractor and sit on them, and they would just like open these arms up and they would spin. I saw them, the videos look cool, but I've never seen them in person and operated one, so I can't really speak on that in terms of mechanizing it. But like I say, with weed control, because we did it by hand with, hand hose and everything, we tried rototillers, weed whippers, stuff like that, but our biggest issue was coming back to that film. It was in the way. Anything that had a spinning on it and you had that film there, it just wrapped up and it just made a mess, and it was annoying. So everything had to be done by hand. So that's what I'm saying. If you don't use film, you can still use rototillers and this and that. It's just, but make no bones about it. It's going to be hard work unless you figure out, like I say, like if you had that cereal rye idea and the whole field is covered in a nice cover crop, and then you just crimp that over, and then that's your mat, because that will keep weeds back. But if you're just down to what we're saying, what we did last year, good old fashioned hard work. All it comes down to it.
I think we own about 30 garden hose now.
We've got it.
So given this mechanical production, I know you guys tried to do the film to do this kind of hybrid system, but almost in your view, with your experience, you would get rid of the film and allow yourself those other weed control options. Is that kind of your overall experience and thoughts moving forward?
Yeah, and the other thing too, the idea we wanted to try last year was, you come in and you plant your hemp and it's out of the ground, and then you can, once it's out of the ground established, maybe come in and interseed between the rows. If you can figure out a way to kind of adjust some equipment to where you plant a cover crop between the rows, that's kind of an idea you can use to at least maintain between the rows, and then you can isolate yourself down to just between the plants you have to get with hands. That's where the farming comes in. And that's kind of the fun part where, hey, like, we want to, just the basic important things, but then, got plenty of farmers on this thing. Like, farmers, get some ideas. Like, just try some stuff, like this. It was amazing this last year what we saw guys come up with in very short amount of time in terms of like ways to go, speed things up. Like, just be creative, really, because like we don't have any one method that's the silver bullet. So at this point, it's just a big open opportunity. Really.
Farmers are great at when they got problems. They're great at coming up with new equipment. You guys, it's a problem. You guys get stewing on it. You start welding and chopping and making things, and all of a sudden you've got a new piece of tool that come in very handy on your operation. So that's just don't sell yourself short. You guys, everybody, these guys are smart doing this. They've been farming for a long time. Just keep doing what you got to do.
A little bit about. But briefly go over, guys, your fertility methods this year, strategies, kind of what your thoughts were, and maybe even your opinions on fertigation versus foliar fertilizer moving forward.
So Fertility, we worked with, used the same products that majority of the people in the area did this year.
Purple Cow Organics.
Purple Cow Organics was a commonly referenced company that seems to have a pretty good knowledge base on, hemp nutrition and all that stuff. We used the products throughout the season. CX1 was the product we used as our biological, and then we added Boost to that to activate it. So Boost is just a molasses. It's a simple sugar. So the whole idea there, and I kind of mentioned that in the video, is if you simple sugars raise the Brix level in the plant, and once Brix levels get to a certain threshold, certain bugs can't process those sugars, and so they shy away from those plants. So think of hemp, because you have to produce this organically. Think of this as like, okay, the hemp is a person, and you're just trying to build up its immune system to deal with as many pathogens as you can. So how do you build the immune system up? You through the biology side of things, the nutrients it needs to be more resilient, because like I said, there's no fungicide, there's no insecticide, there's all this other stuff that you can use and label, and it's all approved. So invest on the biological side. So fertility, like we use the product CX1 and Boost, that was put down with the planter in furrow, just to give that moisture, because we only planted a half an inch. And if anyone else does that this year, remember half an inch can dry out really fast, and seeds need a little bit of moisture to get started. So we laid in furrow with that planter, the starter, the CX1 with the Boost, because that gave it the moisture it needed to germ, and then on top of that was a little bit of a food source to get it going. And then from there, we waited until the plants were about week 4 or 5 of the growth stage, when they were about, I don't know, maybe that tall. That's when we started our weekly feedings. We did a once a week aerial application with the sprayer, as many people saw in the video. It worked. It did well. Our field looked, we've got pictures from mid-season. Like, it looked phenomenal. It was green, very, very little disease, and then September rolled around and we got 23 inches of rain in 30 days, and the health just fell off. We had leaf spot and all this stuff, and I can't tell you, that was a very depressing month to wake up every day and see it rain, and then look at the field just the quality just drop in front of your eyes, because nothing you can do about it. But I'd say, like, on fertility, invest in the biological side of it and go that route. Think of it as like, okay, let's get this resiliency and just deal with as many pathogens as it can, and then just try to stave off other risks. Like I'm saying, get the water off the field. That would be another way to, kind of help with that stuff. But fertility, like I said, we're not experts. There's no one product we're saying is going to work. So again, talk to people who know agronomy and know hemp. If you don't have to be a hemp expert. If someone just understands agronomy really well, like, they could have something of value there. So it's just, I would say, fertility just, yeah.
It's like any other product.
You're bringing up using the analogy of an immune system, right? That's your natural best defense for this plant, is to make it healthy, to give it the ability to succeed, because we don't have any options. And even if we did, this is a product for human consumption. We have to think about the end use and when you're applying those products anyway. So I think that's great.
And then, the other thing I mentioned with that fertility, we don't feed through the flowering period, because we're doing aerial application and it was contact, topical. You don't want to spray stuff on the actual flowers. So at that point, at least from what we've talked to with seed suppliers, they were just like, yeah, once it hits flowers, probably, don't do it, because that's when you can run into some other issues. That's just another point I wanted to make.
And with irrigation as well, drip irrigation versus overhead irrigation, there's been a huge concern, especially late in the season, with floral quality. Not that we really needed it late in the season this year, but in situations where you might, fertigation, where you're supplying the roots instead of the actual plants and getting them wet and trapping that moisture, is something that we need to learn more a little bit about. But what were your thoughts based on your experiences this year?
A drip system and fertigating through that system is probably the ideal way to go from a health standpoint, because of, it's just, number one, it's easier to do it. You don't have to run a sprayer across the whole field again. It does take more time to set up in the front side, a little more expense there, but, there's drip systems you can get for pretty affordably. If you're starting from scratch and you have to buy a sprayer or buy a drip system, well, I'd go with the drip route. But if you already have a sprayer and, and you got existing equipment, you can use that. Like, that's what we did this year. And I wouldn't say, had we not had the wet September we did, maybe we wouldn't have seen the disease in some of the areas that we did, So, like, it's not to say that spraying it aerially, like, is terrible and it will never work. It's just like, from talking to enough seed suppliers and longtime growers, it just always came back to they were fertigating. And I was like, I didn't talk to anybody who was aerial applying it really, and I was just like, and I was thinking, I was like, seems like that's the way to go. And so that's just, our experience from the past year, and it would make sense that that's the best way to go just because of the fact that it's very good at remediating those roots.
It was kind of the path of least resistance for us this year.
Yeah.
Using the sprayer. We've kind of done a lot of other stuff there and whatnot and getting equipment ready. The sprayer was just kind of, we found a cheap one, did it in the budget. We went with that and didn't think too much about it.
And then it doubles as a risk management play. You can feed it through the roots, but then you already have that drip system established. If we run into a random drought, a 2012 again or something like that, you can always turn the water on. So that's kind of if you're starting from nothing, and you're looking at the two, I would lean towards the drip side versus going the sprayer route because you have the added benefit of just being able to turn the water on. So just something to keep in mind.
Great. So what were some of the harvest preparation strategies you used to gear up for harvest? And maybe what were some of the biggest concerns you faced when trying this new strategy?
Well, just like everything we've talked about so far today, basically start at the end and work your way backwards. The one thing, back to field selection, a lot of guys we chopped for last year had their field like 6 miles down a weird lane into a backwoods thing. You had to ford the river and go up the hill and across the stream and all that stuff. I don't know that was as necessary as people thought. I think last year everybody was really worried about theft of plants. And what it became is just a longer trip to get to their field every day to go weed. So one of the things I think about as you're talking about harvest is think about how you're going to get there, right? Think about where you're going to set things up, and then think about what kind of equipment you're going to use to harvest. So from a mechanized perspective, we need a pretty good amount of room headland-wise to turn and come back through the rows every time. You're talking about big machinery. A Class 970 doesn't fit on a postage stamp. Forage boxes, tractors, things like that we use to harvest, which you may or may not have seen in the video, takes up a lot of square footage. So harvest prep, main thing, these guys did a nice job. They planted corn around their field, picked the corn, and now we had all kinds of headlands and room and space to spread out. That was very helpful. But we also chopped for people that planted right, 4 feet away from a barbed wire fence. That's tricky. It makes my job harder. And so as we're thinking about, the harvest, it's thinking about what's in the field that needs to come out. Do you have fence posts in your field? We don't like those in the chopping world, okay? Are there trays or old tools or rototillers or whatever? Get all that stuff out of the field. Make sure your field is clean and ready to go. And whether you're hand harvesting or mechanized harvesting, these are all important steps because you're going to be, in some way, shape, or form, you're going to get the plants to and from the field. So if you're taking whole plants out, hang drying them, doing whatever, you're probably using racks or trucks or carts or something like that. It's important to make sure that all of the pathways to and fro are clean and ready to go. So, we did talk a little bit about, you touched on oil testing. Oil testing and timing in regards to weather are one of the biggest factors that we dealt with last year. We had an infield tester, so we were privileged. We could come to your field, grind up a little bit of your top bud, and tell you exactly, hey, here's your moisture content, here's THC, THCA, CBD, CBDA. Those are very important pieces and fairly accurate tests that we had last year. So like I said, it was a privilege. But that coupled with weather, COAs, oil stack, our own timing, how are we going to get to your field? As a farmer that's hand harvesting, where is it going to be dried? How is it going to be dried? What's the plan to actually get it harvested? So are you going to use a scythe? Are you going to use a knife? It sounds like stupid little stuff, but you gotta put some time into thinking about what that looks like, and don't shy away from it. As you'll hear me talk in the video, the one thing that I heard last year was how everyone was so focused in getting into the ground, and then we'll figure it out. Don't do that. I don't know how to say that any more plain and common, but figure it out and then put it in the ground, right? And harvest is a big deal. Think about all the steps that we just talked about here. We picked the right soil. We vetted a good seed supplier. We got all our licensing done. We insured this thing. We prepped the soil. We planted it. We weeded like crazy. We didn't take vacations because we were weeding so much. we did all this stuff, but then if we don't have a good harvest plan in place and we don't think about that point, it's all for naught. And last year was tricky. Like I said, everything comes out at the same time. When you're talking about non-feminized, oil-driven product, our harvest window on 250 acres was about 20 days. And we had, 6 rain days in there?
Yeah.
6 rain days and some mechanical issues in between, because back to these things being Christmas trees, a conventional harvester does not like them, okay? So we had to figure that out, right? But so pre-harvest, make sure you're prepared, make sure you have a game plan, and then as you get into the harvest window, think about what your plan is. You know, if you're a small acreage grower, a lot of this can be done by hand pretty easily, okay? And I don't mean easily like it's a walk in the park. I mean easily like it's manageable if you're a small enough acreage producer and you have a good plan in place. One of the things I heard last year, probably more than anything, was, oh, we're just going to hang dry it. But nobody really knew, what we're just going to actually hang dry and how much space it took to do that. When we start to look at the plants, and you get to September, that's when reality strikes. September, the plants start to look like a small Christmas tree, or maybe a big Christmas tree, depending on the genetics and how they're grown. But you've got a plant that's, 20 pounds, maybe, coming out of the field? Is that light? 10, 20 pounds, depending on genetics?
Yeah, it depends on size, but yeah, it could be either heavy.
Now you've got 3,000 of them per acre, and you've got 5 acres. So you got 15,000 of those 10 to 20 pound plants, and you've got to take them all out of the field at the same time, because you don't want to break the law, and you want to make sure you harvest as much oil as possible. So just some basic math that I've come up with in talking to different people that are effective at hand harvesting. You need probably, I would say, at least 2 square feet to 4 square feet, depending on plant size, per plant to hang dry effectively. So that means if you have 15,000 plants, multiply by 2, you need 30,000 square feet. Or multiply by 4, you need 120,000 square feet to hang dry all those plants at once. And you need humidifiers, and you need fans, and you need a plan to get them up into where they're going to hang, so you need infrastructure. So we started talking about all that last year and thought, well, these guys had 60 acres, we had over 20. There was no way that was going to work for us. So that enter the mechanical side of harvesting. And I mean, you can go on YouTube for hours and hours and hours and see this stuff being harvested, but the one thing, again, going back to environmental factors of everything, we are not in a dry environment. We talked to a lot of farmers who have been doing this 4 to 5 years in Colorado last year, or 4 to 5 years, prior to last year from Colorado. Their method, they drop it, lay it on the ground, field ret, and then pull it, decornicate or do whatever from there. That's not an option in Illinois. For what Ben said earlier, 23 inches of rain in September, October was just as bad, and we had snow. Who would have thought, right? So one of the things that is important is understanding your environment from a harvest perspective. For us, the mechanical side made it a lot easier. We had big enough acreage. We needed a plan to get it out all at once in short order when we were ready. Mother Nature was ready, but we were ready too. So that's kind of how we landed on that.
Ride the fence either way.
Yep.
A few questions. I know we have a lot of good information in the video if they want to go see specifics on equipment here, but 2 questions I feel that tie into this really nicely. How many pounds of biomass per plant or per acre roughly would you say you guys took off the field, if a range? And then also, will you be chopping again in 2020? Is the use of stripper heads intriguing at the least? And this is something that was kind of referenced in the video, but if you could please elaborate on that.
I can answer the pounds of biomass. That was all over the place, depending on your genetics, how far along it was, this, that. Like we in our field, ironically, pull off less bio than we were expecting because, we use a stripper head for one, but then like how I talked about earlier, the bottom half of our plants got sunlight cut off and didn't produce a lot of flowers down low. So we missed out on biomass that we could have otherwise had. So it was all over the place. There was stuff that averaged 2 to 3 pounds per plant, and then there was stuff that averaged, 6, 7, 8 pounds wet, so
and the other variable there is how did you harvest it? If you hand harvest, you're going to have lower pounds per plant basically, but you're going to have a cleaner bio probably because your touching each stem, stalk, flower. You know, you can go through and get what you want to get. Now there's challenges there too. Don't get me wrong. You have to figure out how to homogenize. But if you're stripping, you again have a better biomass. If you're whole plant chopping, which is another thing that we do, your biomass is through the roof, but you have more stuff in there that doesn't necessarily pay the bills.
It all comes back to that relative percentage thing. So
one of the things too, we didn't talk about this for new growers. In hemp, the one word that pretty much sums it all is, it depends. We hear that and say that all the time, and I sound like a broken record a lot of times when I talk to new farmers, but it's all relative. What you do, you know, it's just a scientific equation to figure out exactly what that answer is. So you're going to hear us say that a lot.
So I guess, Stacy from Hemp Farms and Solcana Hemp Cooperative, what is the accuracy of your field tester? How much did your testing equipment cost? Do you have any recommendations for brand?
Yeah, so our infield tester, you can buy them outright. We work together actually to lease a unit. We used it at the beginning of the season. They used it at the end of the season. It was a monthly rate. This all could have changed. It's not cheap. I think it was right around $5 grand, something like that.
Yeah. It was Eurofins.
Yeah.
QTA.
Yep.
Eurofins is a pretty well-known company just across lab testing in general.
Yep.
And then I've talked to other individuals in the industry who speak very highly of Eurofins and what they've got going on.
Can you
That
spell
specific tester, Eurofins, E like euro, like the currency, fins, FINS. It's Eurofins. QTA was the name of that tester. So that was a tester that utilized STIR testing technology, which is like a laser infrared. And that STIR method basically mimics liquid HPLC. It mimics the way it goes about it. And that what was added to the accuracy of that tester was it's a cloud-based. So it was connected to the internet. We would put a sample in the vial and it would spin and it would reference across a database that Eurofins has built up of millions of hemp samples. So, and it was continuously updated, the cloud-based. So that's why we get smarter.
Yeah, it gets smarter. So one of the things, I remember Benny and I went rounds in the beginning of the season because we did a test and then he sent a test off to a lab, you know, a pretty well-known lab. I'm not going to say the name, but he sent it off and the tests were like apples and oranges. And so Ben goes, I don't know if that tester's working right. So, you know, I got on the phone and we worked through it, whatever. He sent it to a different lab and we were within, what, a point? Yeah, CBD, half, maybe like a tenth on THC. So it turned out to be a pretty effective tool. What worked well for us is we developed it for wet testing. So pre-harvest, we wet tested, and that was super critical for a couple of reasons. Number one, when you send in your testing, or when you send in your test, most of the time you trim a bud, either dry it down, depending on the lab, whatever they want, dry it down, send it off. It sits in the mail. It gets held up by somebody that thinks that it's, you know, drugs. There's all kinds of variables once you send it. Our tester, the nice thing was we actually used a coffee grinder to homogenize, to replicate the chopping process. So we chopped up that top bud, put it in the vial, ran our tests, and we could track. So we have testing results from, what did we start, late September, I think, right? First onset of flower, all the way to November 1st, which was one of the last fields we chopped. So kind of cool. And it was super helpful because as we start talking about harvest, moisture is a huge deal, Did I miss any other questions, Bill?
Just that was fantastic. One just came in. What strain did you plant for the majority of your crop? Did you experiment and do test strips of any other varieties? And also maybe some information on where those seeds came from, if there was any variation based on where you got the seed from.
Yeah. On our field, we did 3 varieties. The majority of it was Charlotte's Wife. That was 40 acres of it. And then another 10 acres of it was cherry wine. And then the last 10 acres was T1. And we sourced those strains from Tesoro Genetics. They're based out of Denver. Quality company. JJ's a guy, their main plant breeder there. He's a good guy. You know, we kind of went out on a limb because our plan A for seed supplier was booked up and I couldn't get in their seed in time. And so I kind of, plan B was I found Tesoro, and I was, I didn't have as much time to vet them as I did the first one. And it turned out that they were quality. JJ stood by us the whole year. Anytime we had calls, answers, questions, he always picked it up, answered. And, he came out for multiple visits. He's in Colorado. He came out, did field visits twice. He hand-delivered the seed, and then he, not saying he's going to do that for everybody, but just for us anyways, it made us feel comfortable. He hand-delivered our seed, and then he was back right before harvest to see how things went, and then, talk about the year and stuff. So Tesoro was that supplier we got ours from. And in terms of what we saw in the field, to kind of answer the question a little further, because we had the year we did, I really taken a lot of it with a grain of salt. I mean, yeah, I would say in terms of what held up to the 23 inches of rain the best, maybe the Charlotte's Wife, but either way, 23 inches of rain, nothing did great in it. So was this a year to really get quality data off of that? No, not in my opinion. But the Charlotte's Wife held up pretty well. I would say the cherry wine held up the poorest in terms of health-wise of disease, because which most people say the cherry wine is more suited for wetter environments. But that's what I say. This year could just be totally, abnormal and outlier because of the extreme moisture. I mean, 50 plus inches of rain in the season.
And do you not make any comparisons between seed companies who sell in these varieties, right? My cherry wine is not your cherry wine, or your T1 is not my T1 based on where we get it. Just be very clear that all seed is not equal in this industry right now. It's where you get it and how they made it. So very important.
Another, was your planting KLR? Is that what you were going to say?
Yeah.
Yeah. So KLR seed, Oregon company. We tested 3 fields that were KLR planted. Really performed pretty well considering the moisture. So keep that in mind. They're an Oregon company. They're tested in Oregon. They farm in Oregon. Big farms, mechanically farmed. They understand the process that we do. We work with them all season long comparing notes. So can't say enough about those guys. They would be another good resource. At least get some information from them. They're not going to be the cheapest, but they're pretty good at supplying the right genetics, I think, for what you want to do.
Yeah, because I would echo that. Yeah, KLR's of what we observed. I can speak on what we personally did with Tesoro, which it seemed to go fine, but KLR hands down in terms of plant health and holding up this year, performed the best in this region for sure.
Will you be chopping again in 2020? Is use of stripper heads intriguing at the least?
Well, yes to the 2020 question. Hopefully it's not as wet and miserable as it was last year. The stripper was basically, we had heard that we could strip with a stripper head, okay? No one really had done it effectively. We saw some videos, we saw it work well, we saw it work not so well. We experienced it working not so well. We trashed ahead in 10 acres. Was it even 10 acres? Maybe 7 acres. The first time we ran it, we had told our customers, hey, we've got the stripper service. We felt comfortable about doing it. Trashed ahead in 7 acres. I cried myself to sleep that night. And then we readapted, rebuilt the head, came up with some technology behind how to actually utilize the head, what to use in terms of the fingers on the head itself, how to operate the head. So we had test and tune of probably 40, 50 acres before we really dialed it in. And you'll see in the video, the plants are about as clean as you can get them. KLR Genetics, we met with them a little while ago. They were just baffled by how clean those plants got. And again, you're leaving the stuff that doesn't pay the bills in the field. You're getting the flower out. So is it effective? Yes. It's just, you have to know, it's just like anything, it's how you do it. It's not what you're doing.
One last question.
Operator.
One last question before we move on into some wrap-up things and contact information for you guys. But what seed are you using this year?
KLR. Probably.
Yeah. We're not going to plant near to the scale what we did this year. We're still sitting on biomass for last year. A lot of people are, but we still have intentions of growing some hemp just on a strictly research basis for ourselves, learning more about the hemp, the fertigation versus the foliar, doing some spacing trials, just very, very small scale stuff, but, and we would use KLR.
And driving, KLR's got a genetic this year, which is pretty cool. It's a flower fiber strain. One of the big things about what we're talking about from a harvest perspective and working with these guys is how do we make this at least a dual crop in terms of revenue sources, and fiber is a big deal. So from a flower fiber perspective, if we could harvest the oil and make use of the fiber by using a genetic that made sense for that, that would be a really sweet thing for us as we move forward. Start at the back of the process and work to the front. And if you can't check every box along the way, don't do it. and I hate to say that, I don't want to pull a black veil over this industry, but if you can't map out every process from back to front, don't do it. The last thing you want to do is get into something and hate it. A lot of farmers this year, probably 20, 30%, would spit after they said the word hemp. We don't want that for anybody. We want you to understand exactly what it's going to look like the whole time. And so we've developed some pretty good technologies around that on the harvest side. We've come a long way in planting. Last year, just to give everybody an idea, these kind of calls and webinars and informational things, they did not exist. It was as much the Wild West as I could ever tell you. You know, we heard of farmers sending boxes full of cash to get seed, and they were getting the seed. You know, things like that. So I would tell you, you're in a much safer environment than we were in 2019. And it sounds crazy to say that, but every year this industry moves 10 years in retrospect to other industries.
Understand we're getting into this. This is a new industry. It's a Wild West. It doesn't matter who you're working with, whether it's a product, seed, or equipment, or dryer, or just services, you know, someone offering some sort of service. Understand that that person is more than likely in version 1 or version 2 of the beginnings of their whole delve into the hemp industry. So what many farmers dove in this year, you know, they forgot that on the flip side of that, the processing was just as undeveloped as the farming side. Understand that no matter who you're working with in this industry, you're very, very rarely going to come across somebody who has decades of experience. If they're offering a product or a service, they're probably on version 1, version 2, still beta testing it. So just understand that most people you're running into are pretty inexperienced as well, that don't, because the biggest pitfall I saw with farmers in this area last year was they were relying on these quote unquote consultants, which are just, a lot of them were just guys who live in Colorado who work at some sort of hemp company. They didn't know anything about farming and, you know, the mechanized part of it and this. And so, like I said, there was just this battling of ideas and words because like there was this big gap that I mentioned between the knowledge base between the two worlds that need to come together. So understand that everyone you're working with, and this is the most important, is very early in the thing, just as much as you are too. So,
you know, with that, I think that's going to be a great point to kind of wrap things up here. You know, we're doing this together. We're figuring things out. You know, use the expertise that we have in the area. That's you guys. That's Green Harvest Solutions. That's High Plains Grains. That's our folks, Stacy over at Sulcana, who have this experience growing. We have folks, American Hemp Research, Andy Houston. Talk to the growers in the area who are doing this, who are local, and who are willing to help you out. I want to say, once again, please take a minute to fill out the QR code for this program and tell us what you thought and how we can do this better. We'd love to have these guys come back. So thank you, Ben, thank you, Grant and Ross, for coming in. This is all of their contact information. I will send it out in an email blast. It will be available on our website along with their production video and the recording of this webinar. Is that all correct on there, guys?
Name's spelled wrong. No, I'll give you a different email. greenharvestsolution@gmail.com would be more preferable.
Thanks, guys. And then a few other things. We're going to have more of these type of grower spotlights coming up. We have one on Thursday with Clara Joyce Flowers, who's a specialty crop operator. So they're going to come at it from more of a specialty crop type, vegetables, flowers, that type of thing. We're going to have Monday, April 6th, American Hemp Research with Andy Houston. And then Tuesday, April 14th, I know we didn't talk about oil and testing, but Rock River Labs is going to be on here on April 14th, and they're going to cover all aspects of what they got from the 2019 growing season from a testing perspective and give some suggestions to new growers. All of these will be available once they're done on our website, go.illinois.edu/hemp. And again, please take a minute to fill out that survey. With that, I would like to say thank you very much for coming, and we appreciate it.